Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's excellent deep dive into Prohibition America was authored by James CJ. So be sure to show him some love in the comments and tell us why you think Prohibition was a failure. Strap in, get ready to deploy your likes and comments, and let's get to it. From the very beginning, America had a drinking problem. From the Pilgrims traveling from England on the Mayflower in 1620 to Plymouth Bay, they did so in a ship filled with beer, among other things too. Centuries went on with the drinks getting stronger and the people drunker. Today, we might consider it an epidemic, but then it was the American way of life, baby. Much like today, no occasion didn't benefit from a drink. Whether it was meeting someone or parting ways, having heat waves or cold snaps, celebrating election wins or drinking to losses, a drink was always present. On January 17, 1920, the US government officially turned off the taps, and the sale, production, and transport of alcohol became illegal under the terms of Prohibition. But similar to the existence of America's drinking problem, the issue of prohibition didn't start in the 20th century. Instead, it began over a century earlier, as far back as 1800. The history of the 18th Amendment spans roughly 130 years and shows the continued fight of a movement and the unintended consequences of its success. This is the story of the United States' failed social experiment. As previously stated, America had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol from the start. During the Revolutionary War, it was said that George Washington himself promoted drinking, albeit in moderation, to his soldiers. Since 1782, U.S. soldiers had received 4 ounces of whiskey as part of their daily rations. Farmers in the American countryside had a barrel of cider by the door for anyone to take from and consume. The nation was awash with drink. The difference was that before 1800, the majority of the alcohol consumed was beer, wine, and cider, with hard spirits being more difficult to obtain. At the dawn of the 19th century, hard liquor like rum, whiskey, and other distilled spirits became more readily available. To put it into perspective, on average, colonial America, pre-revolution, consumed roughly 3.5 gallons of hard liquor, mostly rum, per capita annually. After the revolution, it slowed down for a bit due to a lack of trade with the West Indies and the formation of alcohol production in the United States, which took time to get up and running. However, by 1830, consumption had reached 5 gallons per capita annually. For a long time, nobody questioned the nation's relationship with alcohol, even when it was just the colonies. But in the later years of the 18th century, a physician and founding father by the name of Benjamin Rush began asking questions and studying the harmful effects of alcohol consumption. Rush released his treatise, The Inquiry into the Effects of Ardent Spirits upon the Human Body and Mind, in 1784. Rush presented his findings that excessive consumption was not only dangerous to physical health, but also to one's mental health. It's important to note that Rush didn't argue for people to abstain entirely. Instead, he called for moderation. Beyond Rush's findings, there was also evidence of what excessive drinking was doing to families. Children were going without their fathers, wives were abused by their husbands, and money was squandered on drink instead of food for a man's family. The findings of Rush's treatise prompted some to reevaluate their relationship with alcohol. We can say that the temperance movement started in 1789 when a group of farmers in Connecticut decided to create a temperance association. The movement spread to the other states, with temperance associations forming across the country over the next several decades. The only issue was that the early decades of the 19th century saw a movement disorganized and with numerous differences in opinion surrounding the path forward and what they were fighting for. Then, in March 1826 in Boston, the American Temperance Society, or ATS, was formed, kickstarting a true fight for prohibition. With the formation of the ATS, it was clear that the movement was about to become more serious and organized, and many feared they might be successful in enacting fundamental societal changes. By 1835, membership of the ATS grew to 1.5 million people, representing 12% of the American population at the time. Initially, the movement preached moderation but quickly turned to total abstinence. Church-based branches of the ATS popped up across the country. A separate branch for African Americans was formed, as well as one for children called the Cold Water Army, which made kids pledge never to touch alcohol. And we know how well that works, right? Women were heavily involved with ATS, often considered the most affected by the problems excessive drinking can cause. Women weren't giving much of a voice in many of these ATS branches or the ATS overall. Perhaps the greatest example of this was when famous social reformer Susan B. Anthony was denied the opportunity to speak at one of the church-based branch meetings. She left that meeting determined, and then created the women's temperance movement. Overall, the temperance movement didn't manage to garner many legislative successes. However, their most impressive accomplishment came from the state of Maine, where Neil Dow, the mayor of Portland, embarked on a mission to get alcohol banned across the state. Dow was the leader of the temperance movement in Maine, and on June 2, 1851, the legislation he petitioned for was passed by the Maine legislature. Overall, like the prohibition that would come in the 20th century, this law did little to deter drinking in Maine. For example, the law had exceptions for medicinal purposes, but this and other loopholes made it so that drinking in the state effectively continued under dubious circumstances. Ow, my back! I need some bourbon! In 1855, 4 years passed after the bill was passed. 3,000 rioters, made up mostly of Irish immigrants, protested and stormed City Hall in search of alcohol stored there by Neil Dow.
Where's the booze?
This situation was inflamed when Dow called for the state militia to open fire on the protesters. In what became known as the Portland Rum Riot, one person died and several others were injured. Despite the obvious flaws in Maine's state-level prohibition, the law remained on the books until the end of the 18th Amendment's existence. Beyond the questionable success of the statewide prohibition in Maine, the temperance movement stalled as the calls for war grew louder by the day. On April 12, 1861, the Civil War broke out in America. The temperance movement lost many members during the 4 years of the Civil War, and drinking became a way for everyone to deal with the bleak reality they were living through, much like today. Much of the progress made before 1861 was wiped out by the harsh truth of war. After the Civil War and as Reconstruction efforts began to fade, many reformists turned their attention back to temperance. With the arrival of new immigrants to the US came differing views on drinking, which were far different from those of temperance society Americans. The influx of immigrants who liked to drink was clear in liquor production. My kind of immigrants right there, which topped 36 million gallons in 1850, but reached a high of over 550 million gallons in 1870. The temperance movement reignited when it became clear that drinking was on the rise, as was the power of a newly established beer lobbying group. New versions of the ATS started forming over the next decade. The second rise of the temperance movement even saw the creation of a new political party, the Prohibition Party, officially founded in 1869. One of the most pivotal temperance groups to be created during this period was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, founded in November 1874. Annie Whitmere was the first leader of the WCTU, and under her leadership, the WCTU grew to 1,000 local affiliates in the first 4 years. However, members started demanding more issues be added to their platform, mainly women's suffrage, but she declined, fearing it would dilute the fight for prohibition. As a result, Whitmere was replaced by Frances Willard in 1879. With Willard in charge, the WCTU began expanding its platform to include women's rights, prison reform, labor laws, and more. To achieve their goals surrounding alcohol, they engaged in numerous efforts like peacefully protesting outside of saloons, teaching children the dangers of alcohol, and providing clean drinking water fountains as alternatives. In some cases, these protests worked to shut down bars, but eventually, as the women moved on, the bars just reopened.
Let's go, boys!
Ow! Those gears down there really hurt!
The WCTU looked to new methods of getting prohibition laws enacted in states across the country, and that's when they decided the best method was state constitutional prohibition adopted by statewide referendums. In 1881, Kansas became the first U.S. state to adopt prohibition laws into its constitution, and in the following decade, 19 referendums took place in 17 states. In many states, the WCTU brought the fight themselves. In some states, they were called upon to help bring this issue to the forefront of local politics. In the last decade of the 19th century, temperance activity slowed, but was still present. In 1891, Willard passed away, and with her, so did the group's numerous policy issues, and their platform once again became focused on one thing and one thing alone: Prohibition. The temperance movement was about to experience its third incarnation with the rise of a new organization, the Anti-Saloon League, or ASL, which was formed in 1839. The new group took a couple of years to gain traction, with its influence spreading rapidly in 1895. Pulling much of its support from the Protestant evangelical churches, the ASL was a lobbying group fighting for prohibition nationally. Led and operated primarily by men, the ASL quickly overshadowed the WCTU thanks to its enormous power and influence. They weren't just lobbying the federal government, but fighting for prohibition on a local and state level too. Aiding the ASL cause were business special interest groups experiencing the Industrial Revolution and wanted prohibition to prevent accidents and improve efficiency to match longer working hours and increase production. You know, because we didn't have an 8-hour workday, or, workers' rights. At the head of the ASL was Wayne Wheeler, who might very well be the reason prohibition ended up happening. Wheeler was a powerful player, managing to tank campaigns of non-prohibition supporting politicians. It was said that some members of Congress would look to Wheeler when it came to which way to vote on certain issues. In just over 2 decades, they'd garner the support necessary to change America forever. The 1916 presidential campaigns of Democratic President Woodrow Wilson and Republican challenger Charles Evan Hughes had prohibition as a voter issue thanks to the efforts of the ASL. Regardless, both candidates made an effort to avoid discussing it, knowing how tense the discussion was and fearing alienating voters in what was expected to be a close election. Following Wilson's win and the start of the 65th Congress, the issue was brought to the floor. The first step was seeing where everyone stood, and it turned out the majority of the House favored a prohibition amendment. Referred to as the wets and the dries, the Democratic Party dries outnumbered the wets 140 to 64. In the Republican Party, it wasn't all that different, with the dries outnumbering the wets 138 to 62. An amendment was going to be allowed to reach the floor for a vote. Overall, the sentiment in the US surrounding alcohol had shifted dramatically in the last 2 decades, but more so with the start of World War I. Considering that so many brewers were German and there was a powerful lobbying group called the German-American Alliance, alcohol's reputation grew increasingly volatile. On August 1st, 1917, the 18th Amendment was passed in Congress and sent to the states. As per the Constitution, to pass an amendment, 3/4 of US states are required to ratify it before it becomes law, and Congress provided a 7-year time limit for the states to ratify the amendment. After America joined the war, the ASL called for a temporary wartime prohibition, which President Wilson passed in November 1918. On the surface, this prohibition had nothing to do with the drinking habits of the American people, but instead the need to divert grain production to be used solely for food. However, the ASL likely did it to get some form of prohibition in place before the 18th Amendment passed. Within months, nearly half the 1,000 existing breweries closed down, causing thousands to lose their jobs. And it was about to get a whole lot worse. By January 1919, despite a 6-year time limit and many wets believing it would never pass, the threshold had been reached, with more than 3/4 of the US states signing on to the 18th Amendment, which banned the production, transportation, sale, and importation of alcohol. On January 16, 1919, the amendment was ratified and would go into effect a year later. During this year-long period, states began proposing prohibition legislation in an effort to prepare for how to enact the 18th Amendment. Congress saw fit to put forth a National Prohibition Act, laying out guidelines for federal prohibition enforcement. This became known as the Volstead Act, which Representative Andrew Volstead of Minnesota championed. Despite President Wilson vetoing the Volstead Act, Congress overrode that veto and forced it into law. States continued passing their legislation to aid the implementation and enforcement of the Volstead Act and prohibition overall. Soon, the United States would close the taps, and it wasn't ready for the consequences of its actions. Not by a long shot. On January 17, 1920, Prohibition in the United States officially began. Things started off strong with over 1,500 police officers, referred to as Prohibition agents, sent out to enforce the Volstead Act. It was clear within the first year that Prohibition wasn't going anywhere. The biggest misconceptions about the Volstead Act, and by extension Prohibition, is that it didn't forbid drinking, but instead the importation, sale, and production of alcohol in the US. passing the 18th Amendment and enforcing it were two separate beasts. There was a general assumption by many in the ASL and among the Dries in Congress that everyone would just submit once Prohibition began. Despite a year of planning and the Volstead Act defining the Prohibition rules, the federal and local governments struggled to enforce Prohibition. Many illegal operations began taking place during the 13 years Prohibition existed. Initially, the federal government placed enforcement responsibility on the IRS, which hired and trained hundreds of Prohibition agents and created an intelligence unit to enforce Volstead Act laws and uncover corrupt operations and bootleggers. Later on, they transferred some of that responsibility to the Justice Department. In truth, the department's resources were spread far too thin. Congress only appropriated enough money to fund 1,500 agents to cover the entire country. Ironically, the people who supported and fought for Prohibition were the same people refusing to fund its implementation. It was a product of the era in American politics, small government and stingy administrations. At first, despite the challenges, it seemed like Prohibition was working. Consumption dropped by a third, and alcohol-related deaths and drunken disorderly arrests were down. For the first few years, many consumed alcohol stockpiled in 1919. Some made their own wine and cider at home. Another workaround was getting your doctor to prescribe whiskey to you. You know, back problems. Between 1921 and 1940, doctors wrote over 6 million prescriptions and made $40 million, equivalent to a little over $600 million in 2024. Prohibition meant something different for everyone. For some, it was considered the noble experiment and a win for American society. For others, it was a time of sadness and mourning for a freedom they once had, enjoyed, and was integral to their social culture and lives. Then there was the third group, those willing to break the law and get rich in the process. Perhaps this was the biggest unforeseen consequence of Prohibition, creating a situation that turned law-abiding citizens into criminals, leading to the creation and rise of organized crime, speakeasies, bootleggers, and mobsters. The law of the land, over a century in the making, would lead to a decade of rapid development in criminal enterprises and illegal activities. And the United States was completely unequipped and unprepared to handle this beast of its own making. Until Prohibition was alive and well in the United States, the terminology organized crime didn't truly exist. Since the late 19th century, gangs had been an issue across American cities, but they weren't big-time operations, and instead just small groups of thugs that ran loan sharking and extortion rackets. Before Prohibition, the closest you got to organized crime was the corrupt political bosses and their operations, which included the employing of these small groups of thugs. They had a quid pro quo system going where these gangs handled opposition candidates by intimidation and funneling votes in return for the politicians turning a blind eye to illegal operations like prostitution and gambling rings. Then, things started to change. The power dynamics shifted when Prohibition came to the scene. This is largely because of the speed at which the law came into effect. While there was a year to prepare for Prohibition, it didn't make anybody more prepared. Nobody knew what to do when the bars, breweries, and taverns had shut their doors. This created the question, who would supply the booze to the masses with the legitimate venues gone? Illegal or not, people wanted to drink and they were willing to find a way. A new set of criminals was ready to help ease their troubled minds with a well-equipped and well-run operation. The criminals of the 1920s benefited tremendously from Prohibition, raking in millions upon millions of dollars. The most famous of these gangsters was Al Capone, earning $60 million annually from his bootlegging operation and speakeasies. Despite all these obvious signs that Prohibition wasn't working, nobody made many moves to repeal the 18th Amendment. President Warren G. Harding was abusing Prohibition laws for his own benefit and that of his corrupt cabinet, known as the Ohio Gang. Then his successor Calvin Coolidge didn't support the law in private, but in public, he believed the law should be enforced. In 1929, Coolidge signed the Jones Act, which imposed harsher punishments on bootleggers. Herbert Hoover was a different story, supporting it publicly and privately, calling it a noble experiment. Of course, things began to change dramatically in 1929 when America started to experience another historic event, the Great Depression. With the start of the Great Depression, America was hurting. Money was tight, and despite the hard times, drowning one's sorrows in drink was still very much illegal. That, of course, didn't stop people from drinking, but given the hard times that the nation was enduring, there was a clear class divide. What was left of middle and upper class America retained access to alcohol almost unencumbered. At the same time, the lower class, which had ballooned in members, was far poorer yet still spending what little money they had on alcohol, which had become extremely expensive. Other cracks were appearing in Prohibition that the Great Depression exacerbated. Without the ability to sell and profit off of liquor, hundreds, if not thousands, of cash-strapped restaurants closed their doors. Enforcing Prohibition was expensive, but the consequences were devastating for an economy already in freefall. In 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt ran on the issues of the Great Depression and Prohibition. He promised to repeal the amendment and revive the economy. Legalizing alcohol would help with both. By allowing for the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol, the federal government could create jobs and revenue, both of which America needed desperately. Unsurprisingly, he won the election and immediately started dismantling the amendment that had redefined the early 20th century. In the second month of FDR's presidency, Congress adopted the resolution to enact the 21st Amendment, which would nullify the 18th Amendment. In the meantime, the Cullen-Harrison Act amended the Volstead Act, allowing for the production and sale of low-alcohol wines and beers. By December 1933, Utah provided the last ratification needed to kill the 18th Amendment, undoing more than a century's worth of work. The noble social experiment had failed. Prohibition happened for many different reasons. At its core, it was done to correct what many believed was an unhealthy relationship with alcohol and a stain on American society. It was also done to reduce crime, improve health and hygiene, solve social problems, and reduce the average American's tax burden, which funded overcrowded prisons and poorhouses. The end result was unequivocally a failure in every sense of the word. Despite early drops in alcohol consumption, it increased in later years tenfold. The same happened with crime, which initially fell but then increased and, even worse, became more organized, leading to the rise of mobsters and crime syndicates. If you're considering health aspects, then you can't ignore the fact that a lot of people died from cheap homemade moonshines and bathtub gins, which contain toxins. Additionally, those who couldn't obtain alcohol turned to drugs like opium, which is far worse than drinking. What makes Prohibition even worse is that despite the federal government's insistence on passing the 18th Amendment, they lacked the same level of conviction in properly funding the effort to enforce the law. As a result of this underfunding, it became easy to get away with breaking the laws. The drinking never stopped, it just became more expensive, dangerous, and underground. After the fall of the 18th Amendment, some states retained statewide prohibitions. By 1966, after more than a century, Prohibition was dead in all US states, and the nation never looked back. I mean, there are dry counties, of course, but you know. I hope you learned something today, and if you dug today's video, be sure to deploy those likes and comments and share this video with someone who loves learning about history and its impact on geographical locations. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.